Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Geopolitical Cousins. Hope y'all are having a good week. Boy, is it a busy time to be a geopolitical analyst. Marco and I made time to talk to Ed Richardson this morning. Marco was up at 4 a.m. I was up at 6 a.m. To talk to Ed. Ed is basically one of the best experts you could possibly ask for in the shipping industry. There's information in the show notes about how to follow some of his insights, but we hope you enjoyed the special bonus episode. Later this afternoon, Marco and I will be recording with our second cousin, if you want to call him that, Matt Gherkin. That episode will probably come out tomorrow, and we will keep putting out the content as much as we possibly can, because things are changing so fast. And yeah, that's about all I got. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Write to me, Jacob at jacobshapiro.com, if you have any comments, concerns, questions, etc. I CC Marco and everything. Otherwise, we will see you out there. See you real soon. Hope you're enjoying the content.
We're joined here with an absolute internet sensation, legend, a tanker maven. Can we call you that?
I don't mind.
Ed, it is a real pleasure to have you on the podcast, on the Geopolitical Cousins. Obviously, the critical question on everyone's minds, or at least the critical question that should be on everyone's minds, is how does the conflict impact energy flows? Last year, we've, of course, had Israel and Iran launching ballistic missiles at one another, and it impacted absolutely nothing in terms of international markets and the economy, even though it was a human tragedy and so on. This time around, the difference is, of course, that the Strait of Hormuz is quote-unquote shut. So just wanted to run through some basics with you, right? We don't have to get overly complicated. I know that you're an expert that can blow our listeners' brains. We don't want any brain matter splattering on people's screens, right? We want to keep this. We want to keep this to a point where we can all understand it. But I want to break down some basics with you, and then we're going to get increasingly more and more complicated. What is the difference between the Strait of Hormuz and how important it is, and really any other geography on the planet? Like, how critical is this to the energy markets, and why is that?
Okay, that's a good starting question. I would say that it's interesting context for this to happen for shipping markets, because really since COVID, we've had this quick succession of events which have hindered shipping in one way or another. So we've become really used to reacting to various crises. So the first thing was COVID-related and port congestion. And that was, on the one hand, a dry bulk phenomenon, because you had Chinese ports with automated operations, but the employees had to rotate. So basically, the ships couldn't discharge on time, and that created a huge line with all the knock-on effects that includes. In the opposite direction, going out of China, we had essentially a bunch of bored North Americans who were panic buying goods from China on Amazon, and that caused a surge in container demand, which caused congestion and also just a shortage of vessels in the other direction. Then there was the Ever Given, which got stuck in the Suez Canal. Then the Panama Canal had a surprise drought, so vessels had to go around that. Then we had the step-by-step ban on Russian hydrocarbons by Europe, the price cap, the ban on petroleum products. So all that created a lot of new trade routes. In the midst of that, we also had the Red Sea, the Houthis. It seems like basically every 9 to 12 months, as soon as something is calming down, something else goes wrong. And it's uncanny. And it's kind of like that Bill Murray movie, Groundhog's Day. Like, you wake up, you're like, oh, we're doing another one of these. And so I think it's really easy to become desensitized to it. And similar to the oil market, which has become really used to fading geopolitical risk spikes. Anytime there's anything which causes the price of oil to go up 4, 5, or even 12%, like the war in June 2025, like usually it's happening on a weekend, right? It's become the running joke. And oil traders, they start on Saturday getting the jitters because they just want one thing. They want for the futures to open on Sunday night so they can go short. And it's like, it's become this ridiculous joke. And I think that we're in a feedback loop now, which is getting faster and faster with news, but also faster and faster with analysis and with reactions, where like if someone mentions something, it becomes a meme, and then everyone gets the same idea. And so not only is the news getting faster, but the reaction functions getting faster, which also means that, not only are things getting priced into markets quicker, but also like the reaction to the reactions getting quicker. And so we're getting, it's almost as if there was like a chess game where you would never play one move at a time, but rather 3 or 4 in a row, because you know what the other guy's going to play. So you just do the other moves for him in advance. You're like, okay, here are my next 4 moves, because I know what your move number 2 and 3 and 4 is going to be. So coming back to your original question, with the Strait of Hormuz, it's like the perfect storm, probably the worst choke point in the world, because it affects so many markets. Ironically, it's also becoming more and more important over time because the Middle East is becoming a bigger and bigger supplier, and the Far East, notably India and China, but not exclusively, South Korea and Japan also are taking more and more of the inputs. So I think, for listeners who are not immersed in commodities and energy markets, the main thing for you to keep in mind is Asia has this tremendous appetite for inputs, for raw materials that they can transform and then in one way or another either consume or send back west. So it's kind of ironic because the whole reason that global shipping is still important and can still function is because basically things have to continue to go halfway around the world in order to get from the stuff you take out of the ground to something which you and I could use on a daily basis. So that creates this huge inefficiency. I mean, let's face it, if Saudi Arabia could refine its own oil and consume all the oil that it could pull out of the ground, there would be no reason to ship anything anywhere. So the problem is that Asia, East Asia in particular, the Far East, is really dependent because even though China does produce 4 million barrels per day of crude oil, which most people don't know, they also mine iron ore. They also have, I think they're the biggest coal producer in the world. It's not like China doesn't have these things. It just doesn't have enough of them. And that's also because China has become really good at moving up the value chain, because generally speaking, the raw commodity is not as valuable as the finished product. So this is across all markets. Basically, you're including crude oil, which is a lot cheaper than the refined product. And as we're seeing now, the refined product prices are spiking. And so you can make a lot of money basically just transforming one to the other. So the upshot of what's happening in Hormuz is that none of that stuff can get out. We don't really see a path to that
And
changing.
we know this.
And we know this because, I mean, the vessels aren't moving, and there's spoofing going on, and people are turning off their AIS, which is the equivalent of like a GPS for boats. But even if we just were decreasing the flows by 5%, already commodities prices were spiking, let alone if nothing's coming out. So, it's this kind of truism that commodities are always priced on the margin. Like there's 100 million, give or take, barrels of demand equivalent per day in the world. And if, 300,000 barrels come offline, like the price spikes, right? So
Right.
at the moment, we have more like 20 to 25% of the origin of seaborne oil being cut off, essentially all the way. Okay, so, it's only been like 3 or 4 days, right? But in a way, like the price of oil should be a lot more expensive at the moment. It's really bizarre that it's not. I think markets are being pretty sanguine about this. I think that this comes back to that thing I was mentioning earlier about the knee-jerk reaction, like things are going to work themselves out one way or another, because the markets tend to kind of like, markets hate inefficiency and they just work at them. And you have brokers and traders and everyone trying to take a slice of their inefficiency, because inefficiency is someone's profit margin. So at the moment, we don't really know how this is going to resolve. But the fact is that there's only so long that China and Japan and Korea and India in particular, I think a lot
Right.
of people are talking about China because of the geopolitical implications and because of this, this kind of like conspiracy theory that this is all about China. But India is probably more at risk. It's something like 90% of its LPG imports come through the Hormuz Strait. So this is a really big problem. And I just wanted to raise one final thing on this as kind of a broader topic within a topic. And that is that, to my mind, there has been a tremendous economic tailwind for India since the Ukraine invasion.
Mhm.
And that is that it has gotten this tremendous discount on Russian crude oil. And that's going away, obviously. So already India has a higher baseline cost in order to create outputs of various kinds. But now that's going to be even worse. In other words, we're going from a scenario where India was like uniquely benefiting from a situation where they were the only marginal buyer, and so they could negotiate high volume, high discount. And now not only have they lost that, but we're actually going to a scenario where other inputs like LPG are going to be much more expensive and less available. So, if you're like a macro person, you might want to be thinking about that.
Let me ask you, insurance, tanker insurance. This is, again, you're uniquely capable of answering this question. I'm watching on X, a lot of just regular people are like, wait a minute, what do you mean they don't have insurance? Like the war breaks out and suddenly nobody wants to insure them, but isn't that part of tanker insurance? uh, so explain this, because it's true. There is no gate in the Strait of Hormuz. So some people are confused, and they say, well, how can it be shut? Like, why is it that Iran, without really firing at every ship, has managed to stop the flow of traffic? And this comes down to, your point was the GPS spoofing. Okay, so the ships don't know where they are effectively. It's like their GPS is telling them they're in Beirut. By the way, I experienced GPS spoofing when I was in Cyprus, actually, last year. And, I rented a car and plunged in my hotel direction, and it said I was in Beirut. And I was like, what the? You know what I mean? Like, it literally said, and I mean, like, the Israelis are like hilarious. They're like literally made it so everybody thought they were in Beirut, just so you know that it's them fucking with you. But in this particular case, Iranians are doing the same. So that's one thing. But why is it that the ships are afraid to go? That's what shuts down the flow. That the ships don't want to go. They're just going to stop. They can't get insurance. How can that be solved? And more importantly, can the U.S. administration solve that by just saying like, oh, we're going to figure that out right away? Like, I mean, is there like a line that the White House has posted somewhere on the internet so that people can call and get discounted insurance really quickly?
Trump insurance. It's a new business idea. I don't know why he did it to the DSC. It's got to be. It comes with a gold-plated, insurance packet. Sounds good to me.
Yeah, LLC incorporated in Mar-a-Lago forthcoming, right? Look, the short answer to your question is insurance is actually not the reason why no one's going through. And it's become this mantra that people are repeating.
Mhm.
And, I don't want to say that insurance isn't important. Of course, it's important. And you have to be fully insured for the heightened risk. So, to make a long story short, the risk is impossible to cover the danger which is happening now. And therefore, this is very common. Insurance companies kind of throw up their hands and say, whoa, 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 we need to renegotiate this because this isn't going to work. And the reason that is true and actually is logical is because there has to be a clearing price for someone to be prepared to take unusual risk. I mean, it's one thing to have insurance if you're a firefighter. It's another thing to have insurance if you are standing in front of a huge building on fire and someone's saying, go run up to the 23rd floor and save my cat. Like, in other words, what we're seeing is a kind of paralysis because the math currently doesn't work. I think that everyone who's involved recognizes that it's a very high risk scenario. Again, we have to keep in mind that for the last 2.5 years, we have been watching on social media footage of various vessels getting attacked by ballistic missiles or drones or sea drones in the Red Sea. So we are particularly sensitive to this. This is not just like an abstract thing that people are imagining. This is actually something that we have experienced. It would be a little bit like, imagine how people would react if there was a hint that there was another pandemic coming. I mean, it's just something that's so recent in our minds. So I think with ship owners in particular, we know which ship owners are prepared to take more risk than others. Obviously, the public companies are going to be the most sensitive to avoiding risk. And then you have ship owners who are well known for being cowboys. And then you have ship owners who are either running tankers which belong to the Iranian regime, because it's important to remember that when it comes to the very large crude carriers, Iran has the seventh largest fleet in the world and has for decades. So, it's not part of the general commercial market, but nonetheless, it's a key part of energy infrastructure. And if those vessels were to be removed from the supply, that would be a problem for everyone. So I just want to highlight that for a second. But the real problem is this. The real problem is there are owners who want to go in. There are owners who are available to go in. But it just so happens that this whole thing is unfolding at a time when we are at 18-year highs in spot rates. And so, therefore, the owners see no reason to put their vessels at risk unless they're going to get a very, very juicy premium. And, some people, let's say observers on the outside, might think that that's price gouging, that that's unreasonable. But you have to remember that most of these owners do, in fact, care about their crew members. They certainly care about their vessels, in particular because we're in a bull market. So, in other words, imagine that your vessel gets attacked or put out of service or destroyed. And then imagine that a week later, there's some kind of negotiated peace. You have just taken out one of your cash cows of circulation permanently. And even if the insurance company pays you more than it would cost to replace it, so technically you are a winner economically in the transaction, you're not going to have a new tanker for the next 3 years, which means you're going to lose out on $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 per day, where operating expenses is more like 25 or 30. So this is like an unbelievable gold mine. And it just happens that this war has arrived at precisely the apex of tanker profitability in the last 20 years. And so it's just going to take more money, basically.
So
and
you're
then
saying
people will go in.
So you're saying there's a supply and demand of the actual ships themselves, and because we have been in a bull market, now there's a backlog in basically orders. I mean, if you're a ship owner, one of your tankers sinks. It's not like you go to Costco and pick up another tanker. I mean, like you got to have it, like you got to buy it somewhere.
Yes. And so just to give you an idea of how extreme the situation is, in January, one of the publicly listed tanker companies, Okeanis, who is a relatively small player, but also one of the most popular on the stock market because their commercial outperformance is unusual. And so they've drawn attention to themselves. They were trading at such a premium that they issued new shares to buy a ship delivering 2 weeks later. But they had to pay like a 20% premium to get it now. But because they were issuing stock to do it, it ended up being a really savvy, clever transaction. But the thing is, there are very few of those vessels delivering this year. It just so happens that because people have made so much money in shipping since COVID, the shipyards are full. So as you say, there's no shelf on which you can find a new tanker. So it's really, really bad timing. I mean, obviously, I don't expect Trump to be a tanker investor and to know this, but it just so happens that in terms of the extremity of the supply-demand shock, this could not have come at a worse time. So I think that the spice will flow, so to speak. We will see increasingly one by one, more and more bold owners, and then we're going to see what happens. I mean, no one knows. The vessel owner doesn't know. Maybe even the Iranians don't know, but there will probably be attempts to attack some of those vessels. Whether they can be defended against will depend what the nature of the attack is. Just this morning, we saw yet another tanker near Kuwait be attacked apparently by a small remote-controlled boat, which was sent with explosives. So, I mean, it's going to be a challenge. But if you're being paid $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 per day. And the captain, keeping in mind, always has the ability to refuse to pass through danger. So if he sees something coming, he can just turn around. And normally in these kinds of contracts, they will say, because it's, a very unusual circumstances, they'll get paid demurrage. In other words, they'll get paid to just do nothing and sit until things get safer. So there are contracts being negotiated as we speak. It will help. But the bigger problem in all this is it's not going to be enough. If we're used to having millions of barrels coming through the Strait of Hormuz per day, and instead we're getting maybe 2 million, then the price of oil should be a lot higher than it is now. That's going to have knock-on effects.
But Ed, what I'm surprised to hear, like I didn't know you were going to come here and say that, is that so the insurance thing is not really the issue. Therefore, Trump's tweet that the United States of America is going to issue insurance is not really going to solve it. And your point is just no, it's literally these boat owners, the shipping companies just don't want to take the risk. It's that simple. And so
Marco, could I ask that?
Yeah.
What if President Trump then, instead of the silly insurance tweet that he posted, and I realize it's not going to be this quick, but what if he came out and said, Operation Warp Speed for tankers? The United States will start building tankers. We will start building tomorrow. There will be U.S. funds for it. No price is too high. This market is unacceptable. That's probably a pie in the sky sort of dream. But could even that alleviate some of what we're talking about?
No. The short answer is no. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I sympathize with people who are in favor of this idea of rebuilding maritime capacity in the US. I think that it's increasingly being seen as strategic, but the problem is it's too little too late. I think a much smarter thing would be to ask certain allies who still have shipbuilding capacity, like Spain, some of the Nordic countries, even Turkey. India is trying to ramp up shipbuilding. There's a lot of subsidies now happening, and they're having their own shipping companies order ships from Indian yards, including small tankers and bulk carriers, in order to show the world that these ships will be viable. That would be a lot smarter. There's also shipyards in Korea and Japan, which are wonderful, which maybe could expand if they had more capital. Vietnam. So I think that would be much easier. I think it's kind of naive and also a waste of time to be fixated on this idea that it has to be done in the United States. I think as long as it's done by an ally, that's good enough, and it would be cheaper and probably better in terms of the manufacturing quality, frankly, even though that's not a very popular thing
Ed.
to say.
Oof. When you said Spain, I was like, oof.
Yeah, bad timing on that too.
You were really nonchalant about that too. So,
Spain.
To the guy on Twitter who said, what does Spain do better than the United States? Let's add shipbuilding to the list, my man, in addition to siesta and sausage.
Yeah. The thing is, that could be a longer term fix for this capacity problem. But in the short term, basically, confidence has to be reestablished. And I don't want to be too negative on what Trump did, because there's a certain logic in trying to kind of fake it till you make it and say, we're going to find a way. And that will perhaps instill confidence among the shipping community to at least move things one step forward. Maybe we're not going to get to the point where we're normalizing to normal traffic next week, but we need to take the first steps. We need the first ships to go through. We need to see what Iran's going to do, whether we can defend against it. There's no shortcut here, short of, carpet bombing Iran, basically. And even that, I'm not sure would help. It's really unclear to us how hard-headed the regime is going to be. Who are the people who are going to be launching these attacks? I suppose there was this news overnight that maybe there was going to be another front with the Kurds or maybe the Azerbaijanis or something. Every day there's stuff coming up, and not that that's impossible. Maybe that would help distract and take the attention away from Hormuz. However, I think both of you would agree that the Iranians are largely rational actors, and they think about second order and third order consequences. And also they are clever enough to identify when they found a button to push, which is making people really upset. And when it comes to firing attacks on the Gulf Coast neighbors, I think that they've been really clever about it and it's been effective. And clearly, there's all these discussions, some of which you guys have had, about whether they're able to, whether there's enough interceptors and how much they cost and this kind of asymmetry. That's one thing. But as far as I'm concerned, from what I can tell, they can keep doing this for a long time, just essentially creating chaos. So something similar could be possible in the Strait of Hormuz. It's really unclear. It's even, let's say, narrower, and there are more ports to attack, and there are refineries, and there's a ton of infrastructure. And once that infrastructure goes offline, you can't just press a button and have it come back up. So it's kind of interesting because there's a symmetry there between the exporters and the importers. On the one hand, you have China and India with its refineries and with its steam crackers. So these are for petrochemicals that are taking light end products like LPG and naphtha. And these are huge industrial factories that hate being shut down. And if they are shut down, they can take weeks or months to come back online. And by the same token, it only took a couple of days of this crisis for Iraq to declare that it was shutting in capacity. I mean, that is just unbelievable to me because that's going to cost them like $1 billion plus to get back online. So that means they're extremely pessimistic. And they didn't even see the possibility of enough empty tankers coming into the Strait of Hormuz and just doing nothing but parking there. In other words, the oil is gushing out with such high volume and speed that they just know in advance they don't have anywhere to put it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, ships are not going out; they're not coming back in to, like service storage. Like so, basically, all this oil comes out of the ground. You got to do something with it, right? Otherwise, you have to shut down the production, the field, and that is what you're referring to. Into the case of Iraq, they're just saying like, we don't know where to put this stuff. We're going to have to shut down, and they shut up a considerable amount of production. So, um, Ed, very simple question, and I know we're running out of time, and we don't want to keep you here more than 30 minutes. Simple question. Red Sea was shut down by Houthis. Is it silly to analogize if the Houthis can shut down the Red Sea, then of course Iran can shut down the Strait of Hormuz?
I don't think it's silly at all. I think this is Red Sea Part 2. It's just a matter of how long it's going to take to at least partially normalize. I think the lesson learned with the Red Sea is that some traffic continued to go through most of the time. Obviously, a lot of that is Russian dark fleet or Chinese owners who, according to the rumors, have more or less been coordinating with the Houthis to let them know who they are. There have been some mistakes and some Russian-related tankers attacked. So we're going to probably see some of that also here. The Iranians are a lot more technically sophisticated than the Houthis, and I assume that the Houthis were benefiting from Iranian support, but they still made mistakes. Iran is well known for its educated people, a lot of engineers. I mean, they are one of the biggest drone producers in the world. Tracking ships via AIS is technically a nothing burger. It is the easiest thing to do in the world. Anyone could do it, even a child could do it. So it's not going to be difficult for them to come up with whitelists. The question is, are they going to let through, let's say, Greek owners? Because Greeks are essentially non-aligned players. And I think, one last thing, if I say nothing else of use during this conversation, I think there's this misconception of Greeks as somehow being amoral because they've accepted to carry Russian oil throughout the conflict in Ukraine. And, it's very tempting to come to that conclusion. However, it is in the interests of everyone to have non-aligned actors who are shipping. Because if you have actors that are aligning with one side or the other, that makes trade a lot less efficient and a lot more expensive for everyone. So while it is true that Greeks are, benefiting everybody, including the Russian state, by carrying their oil, if they were not doing that, things would be a lot worse. And I think that this is where the moral ambiguity comes into play. And so the question is, are the Greeks, which, they own something like, must be 40% of the world tanker fleet. I mean, for a small country, they really punch above their weight. And they will be the swing providers of freight. And the real question is, are they going to be able to get through unscathed? If so, this will be okay. It's still going to be a lot more expensive in terms of commodities, but it's going to, some of it will get through. If they attack the Greeks, this is a clusterfuck. This is going to be a big problem. Commodity prices are going much higher.
Yeah, because then the Greek ship owners are not going to go through the straits either. All I hear from you is that Greek EuroLeague teams over the next 5 years are going to do very, very well because there's going to be a whole lot of cash to burn on great American and Serbian players in EuroLeague. Ed, where can people find you?
Hold on, Marco.
Wait,
I got one more thing. One more naive, very dumb, very high level macro question that I have. Because what I'm hearing from you over and over again, the math doesn't work. It's top of the tanker market, like everything else. And I cannot help but think, part of the reason that the European Age of Discovery happened, it wasn't just because of this, it was because the Ottomans rose and the Silk Road was cut off, and you couldn't trade Europe to Asia anymore. And so you had to build these ships and go around and go to the New World, everything else. At what point is there a point where the world looks at the Strait of Hormuz and says, this is really dumb to keep going back to this well over and over and over again? We can get oil in other places. There's discoveries in the South China Sea. There's discoveries in Guyana. We can do shale. We've got renewables coming online. Like, is this a moment where China and India aren't thinking about how do I get access back, but rather, okay, we're done with the Middle East. We don't want to do this anymore. You guys want to blow each other up and do this? Fine. Do it to each other. We don't want to participate anymore. Is there any chance that this is this kind of inflection moment, that it's top for Strait of Hormuz and that 10 years from now, nobody's going to give a shit because of everything that's happened? Or is it just, are we too lazy? Is it too ingrained? Is it because the spice is bubbling out of the desert in Iraq and just nobody wants to do the hard work of doing anything else? I just had that naive question that I wanted to throw at you before we go.
I'm really glad you raised this topic. This is a brilliant point, and also one which becomes quickly politically uncomfortable for a lot of people, because it turns out that the savior for this situation is right in front of our noses. It's Russia. It's so obvious. They're sitting on all this oil they can't sell because it's been sanctioned, but they would be delighted to sell their oil and LNG back into the same markets instead of having it go to Asia to be refined and sent back west. So the short answer is absolutely. This is going to be a kind of a second version of 2022, where we come to the conclusion that energy security and feasibility of supply is paramount. And therefore, this will benefit offshore companies and oil services companies, which, by the way, have been selling off a little bit recently. And that's been a total head scratcher for me, because whether it's US shale and Canadian producers are the first ones to benefit, because any incremental barrel, not only will they have extra demand for, but also they will be incentivized highly with Brent at $80 plus to produce more. You've got Brazil, you've got Mexico, you've got Colombia. There are even fields in the UK and Norway which will be producing more oil. Basically anywhere you dig a hole, you're going to find oil. We've increasingly come to know. So I think that if oil prices really are, let's just imagine now that this is going to become Red Sea Part 2. Oil prices are going to vary between $80 and $100 per barrel for the next 3 years. You're going to see a lot more supply come online. And effectively, we can't do without the Middle Eastern oil, but some of that Middle Eastern oil would be sent elsewhere. Maybe new pipelines will be created.
I think that's I think that's the solution, right? Jacob, the example you're using where the Ottoman Empire cut off the Silk Road, the truth is, it was still critical to get those spices from Asia and those silks. We did not get silks in the New World. What happened was we developed new trade routes, right? That's what happened. And so the analogy is actually not that oil will come from somewhere else. I think the analogy is that the pipelines in the Middle East will have to be restructured. So if the Strait of Hormuz is a choke point, then clearly all the oil produced in the Eastern Arabian Peninsula will have to be shifted to the Indian Ocean through Oman. So you want to be buying real estate in Salalah, pipelines through Jordan. Maybe you want a controversy. Here's a controversy. Load your VLCCs in Haifa. Israel wins again, even more.
But it's the definition of insanity. Like, okay, so instead of out of the Persian Gulf, we're going to build a pipeline right next to the Persian Gulf. They can bomb that too. We've seen what the Ukrainians have done with drones. Like, this region sucks.
Turkey.
Like, why are we building infrastructure in this region? Go build infrastructure somewhere else. There's oil in the rest of the world.
The real answer to that question is geology, because the oil that you get from other places is not the same oil. And I think this is something that people are beginning to awaken to, that even though oil is, strictly speaking, a commodity, it's actually more useful to think of it like coffee. Coffee from different areas have different tastes and different acidity levels and different characters. And with oil, it's very similar. And so the problem is, because basically the geology is similar, let's say underneath the Middle East, they tend to have this type of medium sour barrel, which is very useful for refiners because it yields high value products. And the stuff in the West, whether it's Brazil or a shale, tends to be much lighter slate. And if you want gasoline, if you want naphtha, that's fantastic. But if you want to make diesel, it's terrible, or jet fuel for that matter. So you really need both. And therefore, Canadian's going to help compensate. Now, another thing, which is, Venezuelan's going to help a lot, because sometimes you can mix cocktails, and the Venezuelan stuff is extremely heavy. So if you mix it with some others which are lighter, maybe you can come to a kind of a compromise which can replace some of that Russian or Saudi supply. But this is a long-term problem, and that's not going to be fixed overnight.
All right, yeah.
You're thinking along the right lines. I mean, this is exactly what's going to happen. In other words, we're going to find an inefficient problem for a market which is already perfectly efficient, just to get around solving something which we can't maybe we don't have the balls to solve, or we don't have the political will to solve because it's going to become too unpopular. To quote a geopolitical analyst, material constraints, right? That's what it all comes down to. And you just can't get around it. Maybe it's because Trump doesn't want to lose the midterms, let's say, that he's not willing to be aggressive enough to make this happen. And so therefore, people will be exporting out of Haifa. I mean, I'm just making things up. It's just a stupid example, but that could be where this is headed, just because we don't have the appetite to do things that we need to do.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah. Ed, tell the listeners where they can find more about you if they so choose.
Well, I'm on Twitter, Ed_Finn, and then I write a Substack about shipping and commodities, edfin.substack.com, which is very niche, but I'm happy to say is pretty popular. And then in addition to that, I have hedge fund clients and high net worth individuals who want to talk about these kinds of trades, because I'm really, really focused on them. I would say that it's not so much that I understand them better than anyone else, but I am much more focused on them than anyone else. So because I'm not task switching between this and gold miners and AI data centers, I think about this in my sleep. So if anyone wants to talk about this subject, I can talk for hours. I love it. I think it's fascinating, and there's news every day which affects these trade flows. So it's just never-ending fascination.
Ed is the guy we turn to when we need information about this stuff. So yeah, absolutely. Anyone who's in the markets or just wants to become more aware of how the world carries its goods, this is the man. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, guys.